The following is an HDNet original presentation.
Good evening. Tonight we bring you a very special presentation, a conversation with some of the best minds in our country about the state of public schools. This is a topic we find monumentally important not only for our children right now, but also for the future of our nation. We began covering education in Detroit more than 2 years ago. The city is an example of what happens to schools, students, and the city as a whole when the worst circumstances collide. In our documentary, titled A National Disgrace, we showed how years of economic decline, apathy from adults, political infighting, some stealing, and outright neglect have decimated the Detroit public schools.
It was this district that robbed these kids of their education,
Denying more than a generation of children their dreams. The city suffers from a functional illiteracy rate of 47%. That means almost half the population of Detroit cannot read beyond a very basic level. Detroit has some of the lowest standardized test scores ever recorded, and there is a soaring budget deficit.
So, are you in?
Despite valiant efforts by many of the hardest working educators, Detroit seems to be unable to correct the downward spiral. Sadly, Detroit is not an isolated case. Newark, Buffalo, Cleveland, and many other school systems are struggling, failing to do the very thing they are mandated to do, educate our children. All the more sobering is that this is a problem that no one has managed to successfully address on a large scale. In an effort to improve our schools in 2002, then President George W. Bush signed into law what was called the No Child Left Behind Act. That law mandates that every student in every school be, quote, proficient by 2014. But as that deadline now nears, the reality of our children's educational attainment is stark. More than 80% of our schools will likely be labeled failing. That's right. 4 out of 5 schools are not teaching our children. The Obama administration has issued its own blueprint to tackle the educational crisis, called Race to the Top.
This is one of the largest investments in education reform in American history. And rather than divvying it up and handing it out, we are letting states and school districts compete for it. That's how we can incentivize excellence and spur reform and launch a race to the top in America's public schools.
Race to the Top is a contest among states that awards tens of millions of dollars to those with the best plans to toughen academic standards, recruit and keep effective teachers, track student performance, and turn around failing schools. So we begin our conversation with one of the architects of Race to the Top, John Schnur. Mr. Schnur is also the co-founder and chairman of the board of New Leaders for New Schools. That's a not-for-profit organization that trains principals to lead intercity schools. We're also joined by Dr. Pedro Noguera, an urban sociologist and professor of education at New York University. He's nationally known for his study into the ways in which schools are influenced by social and economic conditions in urban areas. One of his main focuses is closing the achievement gap between poor and middle economic class children. We spoke with them at the Dual Language Middle School in New York City. Well, first of all, thank you very much for doing this. We've stated on our program, and others have stated, almost without exception, that the schools in our country are in crisis. Are we overstating it?
Well, my view is that the crisis we face is a sort of two-pronged crisis. But we've got a lot of success to build on too. And how I would define the crisis is first, is we have pockets of severe underperformance in this country. Pockets especially of kids in poverty, kids of color, kids who've been underserved, and we are not doing right by those kids or our country, because our country won't succeed without lifting educational outcomes for kids across the spectrum. The second crisis we have is that as a whole country, we have some great pockets of success, and we actually haven't gotten worse in education in the country. But the problem is we haven't gotten any better. We were first in the world in educational outcomes in many ways 40 years ago. We've now slipped to the middle of the pack among industrialized nations. That's not because we've gotten worse. That's because other countries, some other countries, are getting much better to keep pace with the needs today. So we got a severe gap, and we got to lift all boats to achieve the results that some other countries are beginning to, and we haven't yet.
Dan, I wouldn't use the term crisis, because a crisis is almost by definition a temporary condition. This is not a temporary condition. This is long term. These problems have been festering for many, many years. And they're really problems of poverty, problems of inequality. That is, wherever poor people are concentrated in America, almost always schools are bad. And they're bad not simply because of what's happening in school, but they're bad because the schools typically don't have the resources to respond to the needs of children that are related to poverty, whether those be health conditions, nutrition, etc.
John, let's talk about possible starts to solution. Let's accept there's no single bullet, there's no magic bullet, and it isn't going to happen quickly. But in those areas where the problem is most acute, Detroit, Cleveland, Buffalo, New York City, perhaps not at that level, but not too far away from it. How do we start? How do we as individuals, how do we as parents, how do we as a society begin to get this problem under control? Or do we?
The good news is we don't have to only theorize about it at this point. There are now proof points of individual schools and classrooms in high poverty communities across the country and others that are demonstrating that kids from all backgrounds really can and do achieve at high levels when we get a few fundamental things right. So what are those? What do we learn from those proof points? Number one, the expectations in the school are very high from the adults for the kids and for the other adults in terms of what the kids are capable of academically and behaviorally. The expectations for academic and conduct are important. Second, a focus on great teaching and great school leadership. We can't blame the problems in education in America on our teachers. America's teachers are our greatest asset. We need to celebrate and lift up the profession. And third, it's not a short-term effort. As you've noted, nothing turns around in a day or a month or a year. The places that succeed with their country or school, they're at it, they're persistent. When they have problems, they persevere. And that long-term persistent focus generally leads to much better results over time.
Why have schools become more racially segregated over the past few decades? Many Americans believe that we're beyond the point of segregated schools, but you used the phrase earlier, segregated schools. I mean, why are we in 2011 talking about a problem that we were supposed to be on the road to conquering in 1954?
Well, there are many reasons. I think first and foremost, the courts changed course. Basically said, this is too hard, busing is too hard. The kind of tools that we used initially to try to bring about desegregation proved to be very conflictual. But then if you look at the parts of the country, it's interesting that many parts of the South are now more integrated than the North. And that's because in many places where you have people of very similar economic circumstances, they still rely on their public schools. The racial bias, I think, unfortunately, is still alive and well. And it's one of the things that I think that is our country's Achilles heel, that weakens us as a society.
Well, in thinking about how we get students to succeed, more students to succeed better, do parents, teachers, or principals have the most responsibility?
Well, I think each of us have responsibility, even while we ask parents to step up and support parents in doing that and understand that's not always easy given the demands on parents' lives today. We also have to step up and help teachers and principals take responsibility with support, and it pays off when it's done well.
The strongest predictor for how well a student will do in school, how well they'll do in college, how well they'll do on the SAT, is how much money their family earns. Right? Income, family income, when combined with parental education, is what's driving outcomes. And it's the reason why what we really should be doing is making sure that those children who come from the most disadvantaged families are receiving much more than they get right now. Better quality education, but much more social support, because they can't do at home what a person with a college degree can do in the way of providing support to their child.
Go ahead, please.
I think understood in the wrong way, It's not the way you mean it. Understood in the wrong way, that's a recipe for paralysis. Because it leads people to think, oh, you know what? The problems with our schools, the kids come from a poor family, and therefore we can't do anything. Which then leads people to mistakenly say, okay, you know what? Let's just work on other issues. But the facts do show that we, in the city, in almost every city in the country, there are schools serving mostly poor kids that are getting better results than schools with mostly kids who are working middle class or more affluent. So there are these individual proof points that show what Pedro's saying, which is true in the absence of better schools, doesn't have to be true if you actually tackle the problem right.
So to me, it's not about paralysis. There are schools that John describes that are showing us, yes, you can provide a high quality education to poor children and have a great impact. But most of the countries that are outperforming us, they make sure that all children have access to good early childhood education. We don't do that. They make sure that kids have access to good health care. We don't do that. Are you saying that those would not help us in educating more kids?
Not at all.
Okay, so my point is that we need a more comprehensive strategy. What we've been doing is pretending that schools could solve this by themselves. The achievement gap, if you look at the data, was closing into the late 1970s and 80s. And then suddenly it went flat and started going the other way. Why? Because as a nation, we stopped investing in efforts to end poverty. And I would say that unless we do that, we're not going to see the kind of gains. And I think, I'm not a pessimist, but I am a realist. And my realism tells me, look at the data. And the data shows you right now that some kids, by virtue of who they are, where they live, have much less of a chance than others. And it's not because they don't have the talent, it's because they don't have the opportunity.
Now, when we return, you'll hear more from John Schnur and Dr. Pedro Noguera. So stay here with us. Let's talk about some efforts that have been made to improve schools. Let's start with the No Child Left Behind program. A success, a failure, or still somewhere in between, John?
No Child Left Behind, essentially it's somewhere in between. One good thing is it has shined more of a spotlight on the difference in performance across schools and across the student population. We can now see more clearly as a country than we saw before. So we have these tremendous achievement gaps for low-income kids, kids of color, this requirement to have disaggregation of data, meaning we have to look at how kids do in different, if they're poor, or if they're a child of color, or if they're disabled. That kind of shining a spotlight has been important. And the press on schools to do better is important. Now, unfortunately, I think there have been some big missing pieces and flaws in No Child Left Behind. It entirely missed the focus on what does it take to support the quality of teaching. The only thing it did had some process requirements that in the end made teachers feel overburdened, that sort of fueled the culture of compliance in American education. And despite some good intent, it missed the most important thing we could do in schools, which is actually how do we support an elevated teaching profession and the quality of teachers that we need for this country.
What about you? No Child Left Behind a success, failure, or hard to tell?
Look at the evidence. We have dropout rates of 50% and higher. That's 10 years after No Child Left Behind. If it was not a clearer sign that something is wrong with what we're doing, it's that. We have kids now who are bored to death in school. Bored to death because school has become little more than preparation for a test. And our best teachers are being driven out of those schools because most teachers don't go into teaching to prepare kids for tests. They go to teaching because they have a passion for learning. Testing, and this is what I have to take strong issue with, testing is only a tool. Kids don't get smarter because you test them. And it's only a tool that works if you give the teacher the information from the test in a timely manner. That is, we should be using testing for diagnostic purposes to find out what have our kids learned, how much have they learned, and then we should give the teacher information back so they say, this one needs to get more of this because they're clearly not performing. What we do now is we test the kids in the spring, we give the teachers the results in the fall when they no longer have the students.
Well, John, that brings us to you because you're one of the architects of the federal program of Race to the Top. First of all, inform our audience, refresh their memory, what is Race to the Top?
The Race to the Top is an initiative that President Obama championed that basically took a very different approach from No Child Left Behind. Instead of mandating that all the states and school systems do things a certain way, he incented them and said, you know what, for those states and communities that are willing to set higher standards, come up with creative ways to invest in better teaching, that are willing to have data that drives improvement, that invests in the turnaround of the lowest achieving schools will have a competitive process and give funding to those people and those states and those systems that have made the most progress and have the best plans. Not everywhere, and the president didn't insist that every state participate at the top. He said, if you want to, you actually can improve the way you set standards for kids, invest in teaching. So I think the jury's out on the ultimate results of Race to the Top. It's not the solution, it's a vehicle for communities and states that want to make schools better to get schools better.
Do you buy this? That Race to the Top is at least a start in the right direction?
I would say I'm more critical. I don't think that it is, I give the administration credit for putting resources into schools at a time when schools are so desperate for resources. I do think it is invested in some strategies where there's no evidence. For example, evaluating teachers by test scores. I mean, these are the kinds of things, these formulas that are so rigid, so prescriptive, they really don't even speak to American ingenuity. We have to be much more creative than that, and I'm troubled by the lack of creativity in what I see in much of it.
Let's talk about teachers' unions. Are they a big problem in getting to where we need to be with our school systems?
Sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. I like to remind people, the highest performing states in the country, Massachusetts and Minnesota, are highly unionized. And the weakest states, in terms of academic performance, are not. They're in the South. If the union were the problem, we should see the southern states as our high performers, but they're not. So there's more to it than that. It's not to say that there aren't cases and ways in which unions get in the way. They do, but so do state departments of education with regulations. So what we need to be clear about, where are the areas that we need changes? I think one of the areas that the unions need to loosen up is in how we evaluate teachers and make it easier to remove teachers who are not effective in the classroom. But to have a blanket statement to say that the union is the problem is not matched by the evidence of what we see out there.
I think the teachers' unions and the school boards and the school superintendents and we as parents and educators have all got to change. But I don't think we should finger point and blame one. On the other hand, I think when there are times when there's a teachers' union that is not supporting improvement, or a school board's not supporting change or improvement, there should be a spotlight on that. But I think we all are going to have to work together in order to get better results, but we cannot stay the same.
Let's talk about charter schools. Some people say that's the way of the future, that's the way to go. What say you?
I have no problems with charter schools. In fact, I support them when they are designed to truly bring about some innovation in public education, and our best charter schools do that. Where I have a problem and where I question the role of charters is when they are allowed to screen students and they're basically not serving the same population of kids. And what we've done, and this I think is very problematic, is we've created a competition between the public schools and the charter schools. So instead of learning from each other, they're competing. And it's a very unfair competition.
Advantage charter schools.
Advantage, because they're getting a lot more resources. In many cases, the best charter schools are spending a lot more money than the public schools. And what's more, they're not serving the same children. The public schools, the neighborhood public schools that is, are serving those children. And what we need to make sure is, given that over 90% of American kids are in those schools, that we don't ignore them and focus in instead on these boutique charter schools.
John, do you have something you wanted to add?
I was going to say, I think that we have to invest in what works. I think there are really good public district schools and really bad ones. There are really good charter schools and really bad ones. And essentially we should be focused less on what type of school, in my view, and more on quality and results, and help expand and support what works to go to a greater scale. And I think charter schools done right are an important strategy, but in the end, we need a high quality public education in this country with charters as a piece of that in order to serve all of our kids much better.
What's the single most important thing for Americans to know about our schools at this moment?
I think the single most important thing for Americans to know about our schools, about education, is that the driver of educational outcomes does not need to be the background of a student and a student's family. The driver of education, we're seeing proof of this, can be high expectations, great teaching, great leadership, and those things can in fact help kids from all backgrounds achieve at much higher levels. I'm not saying that poverty is not an issue, that social background is not an issue, but we have seen so many examples of schools serving low-income kids, and all kids, that do so much better when the expectations are high, when they've got great teachers, great leaders. And I think this in some ways is the central philosophical difference among some people focused on this issue. Do you believe on one hand that schools can't change things for kids? Or do you think that schools could change everything? I think the evidence shows that good schools with great teaching and great leadership can change a tremendous amount for our kids. Not everything, but we shouldn't be paralyzed. I think that's what the number one thing that Americans ought to understand. And if we did understand that, I think we would do a lot of things differently in education in this country, and I'm hopeful that we will.
In your judgment, based on your experience, how should we view public schools in America?
I think we should view them as being vital to our national interest. The only way we can ensure that the access to the American dream is still there for all children is through good public schools. Public schools is what gives people, particularly people of disadvantaged backgrounds, access to opportunity. And that's the reason why, as a nation, we were the first nation to create public schools. We did it not because the federal government required, we did it because small towns in Massachusetts came together on their own around the idea that we should educate children at the public's expense, because we wanted to make sure that the children of bankers didn't get any more than children of farmers. And it was that ideal, right, that schools would be the equalizer of opportunity that I think makes America, people talk about American exceptionalism, that's part of American exceptionalism, that ideal.
Thank you both very, very much. Appreciate
Yeah, it's
you
been
taking
a pleasure.
the time.
Thank you.
Thank you, John.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much. When our program continues, you'll hear from one of the most vocal critics of the current reform movement in public schools.
This is a federal law that has set our public school system on the road to destruction.
Welcome back. President Obama and his Secretary of Education, Arne Duncan, have instituted an educational reform movement that has received a fair amount of bipartisan support. Its focus on using test scores to evaluate teacher performance has been backed by big-time educational philanthropists like Bill and Melinda Gates. But not everybody is a fan of this approach, and perhaps the most vocal, the most visible, and respected critic is Dr. Diane Ravitch. Dr. Ravitch has been studying American education for more than 35 years. A best-selling author, Ravitch served under Presidents Clinton and George H.W. Bush administrations. She was an early supporter of the No Child Left Behind Act. Dr. Ravitch has since changed her opinion of that law. As we sit here today in the spring of 2011, what's the single most important thing for people to know about our public schools?
Well, I think one of the things that's important to know, and there are many things, but one is that they're under attack. They're under attack based on claims that they should have 100% proficiency. This is the mandate in federal law, is that if your school is not 100% proficient, every student in that school 100% proficient, by the year 2014, it will be labeled a failing school, and it will be closed down, or the teachers will be fired, or the principal will be fired. All these draconian punishments that are part of the federal law called No Child Left Behind. It was passed by Congress in 2001 with overwhelming bipartisan support, signed by President George W. Bush in 2002, and this is a federal law that has set our public school system on the road to destruction.
You yourself supported it at one time. You changed your mind. First of all, what was wrong, what is wrong with No Child Left Behind, and why did you change your mind?
Well, it's turned out to be a very failed program. No Child Left Behind has created this tremendous emphasis on testing, and our nation has spent billions on testing and on test prep, and we really have very little to show for it, because even when the scores go up, and they sometimes do, the kids then go to college and they need remediation in reading, writing, and mathematics. So it's not even having the desired effect, and we don't seem to get beyond the reading, writing, and mathematics to anything that's complex.
Well, taking that into account, are we overall in the main, do we have an education system that is turning out high school graduates who are prepared to move to the collegiate and university level?
I'd say that many, many kids are not prepared to do so, but probably no more so than in the past. There's an assumption that we could look back to the past and there was a golden age, and anybody who studied history or who has a long memory knows that there was no golden age. There were always many kids who dropped out. The dropout rate has gone down and down and down. It's still too high. But there are so many things today that you can say that are good about education, and there are many things you can say today that are bad about education. I am really increasingly disgusted with the status quo, which is the status quo of the past 10 years. We have, in an effort to raise test scores, concentrated our schools so heavily on testing that we're leaving out some of the most important things that kids should be doing, the kinds of activities and projects. And many schools are, for example, dropping the arts and cutting down on time for science or history or geography and foreign languages. That's bad education. So I'm very much an opponent of the status quo. But I think that what we hear today is the conventional wisdom, whether it's coming from the news magazines, the television, popular documentaries. There has just been a kind of ridiculous attack on public education that has no point, in my mind, other than to advance a privatization agenda.
Well, frequently when students fail, there's a debate over whether it's the school's fault or the parents' fault. Where do we start first to help the children?
Well, of course, we have to make sure that all of our teachers are well prepared. I mean, school success depends on a lot of different actors. First of all, you have to have adequate resources, and many of our schools don't have adequate resources, particularly in the inner city, and also in rural schools. You have to have teachers who are well prepared. You have to have families who are involved in helping their students, making sure that they come to school and that they've done their homework, that they're in regular attendance. I know that there have been many studies by economists about what is the most influence, who has the most influence. What they find is that in terms of test scores, teachers account for about 10 to 15% of what students learn or don't learn in school. That's the biggest single influence within the school, about 10 to 15%. Families account for about 60%.
60%?
Yeah, 60%.
Is there a magic bullet?
No. This is the great misconception that many of our foundations have. I mean, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, they had a magic bullet in the early part of this century. They thought it was small high schools, and so they helped, put out $2 billion to break up large high schools into small schools. And then 2008, they turned on a dime. Bill Gates turned on a dime to just drop the whole thing, decided that wasn't the magic bullet. Now the magic bullet is we have to evaluate teachers. We have to find a way of evaluating teachers, usually by using student test scores, which is totally invalid, and then fire them. If we can just find and fire enough bad teachers, everything will turn around. So now the whole country, because Gates is pumping so much money into this, because Arne Duncan and Bill Gates are big buddies and they agree, and because Obama and Duncan and Gates agree, now the whole country's focused on how can we teacher evaluation is the silver bullet. It is not the silver bullet. We have many wonderful teachers in our schools. They're dedicated, they're hardworking, they work way beyond the hours that they're paid for. Sure. And it's just an insult to them to say, we're going to somehow replace all 3.5 million of you and find some other 3.5 million. Or maybe we'll only replace 1 million. Where are they going to come from?
I think you've made this clear before, but so there's no misunderstanding. Do you support standardized testing as it's used in the country today? Well,
I'm a supporter of testing when it's used for information and diagnostics. I think we need to teach children a more sophisticated kind of problem-solving approach where they weigh different outcomes and think about what happens if I do it this way versus that way. Teach them a moral compass and an ethical compass. All these things are terribly important that are not captured by a multiple-choice test. But, I would reiterate, I'm not against testing. I'm against the misuse of testing. And when tests are used to punish or to reward, they're misused.
But what other way do we have to measure whether a teacher is doing a good job, whether a school is doing a good job, and how much the student is learning? What other methods are there?
Well, the most important method is to have good people leading the schools, because they're the ones who have to go into the classroom on a regular basis to observe the teacher in the classroom. That's going to be far more important than the test scores. And the test scores will not reflect on whether or not that man or woman is a good teacher. So the test scores are not really a good measure of teacher quality.
Let's talk about charter schools. What's wrong with charter schools in your view?
Well, there's nothing inherently wrong with charter schools. They are deregulated schools that are that they're considered public schools because they get public money. They're under private management, and they're free of most regulations. There are some excellent charters. There are some absolutely terrible charters. On the whole, they don't get better results than regular public schools. The original idea of charters was that they would be collaborators. They would learn new lessons. They would be experiments, innovations. Whatever they would learn, helping the neediest kids, they would bring back to public schools and make them better. But now they see themselves as competitors to public education, and in some places, like New York City, want to drive the public schools out of their buildings and take their space away. So, there's quite a huge movement to privatize education.
Let's talk about unions. We now move into what you and I both know to be controversial territory. Do unions undermine great teaching?
No, of course not. You can have great teaching with a union. You can have great teaching without a union. I just consider unions to be not relevant, and except that they do unions do two things. One is that they protect teachers against arbitrary firing, and there have been arbitrary firings. One of the reasons that there are unions is because in the past people have been fired because of their race or their religion or because somebody wanted their job to give to a political patron. A lot of nepotism, cronyism, and so forth. So unions were created to prevent those kinds of abuses. The second thing that's very important is that there are power in the state legislature that the governor has to deal with. So when the governor comes in and says, let's cut $1 billion out of public education, that he has to deal with the union because they're there as a force. If the governor can get rid of the union, as many governors have, they're free to slash everything out of the budget and cut it down and hand out vouchers and create more charter schools and privatize and et cetera. So the union is a protector for public education, and a lot of people don't like that.
We're right at the end now, and for all I know, given your background and your standing, it may have happened. But let's pretend that I'm President Obama for the moment. And I've said to you, Doctor, I only have a short while here. Give me one thing that I could do as president that you think might help and help considerably, if not right away, pretty soon.
Well, I'd say focus on very young children and the conditions in which children are living. If you could bring in the best minds in the country, let's work on the fact that we have more than 20% of our kids living in poverty. That has a huge impact on their performance in school. If we could somehow lift the burdens of poverty off families and off children, we'd see much better school performance. If we want to talk about just schools, let's talk about a good vision of what do you want for your children, because what you want for your children is what I'd like to see for all the children in this country.
You said you're worried about the destruction of the public school system in the United States. Fairly recent, last few years, I've been meeting more and more people who say, right, that's what we need to do. We need to destroy the public school system. Is this a movement that says, look, we don't need the local, state, or federal government having anything to do with schools?
There is a movement afoot, and it's funded in large part by people way out there on the right who believe in privatization, who believe in deregulation and in free markets. I have to say that my faith in free markets was shaken a little bit back in the fall of 2008 when the free markets practically brought our economy to its knees. But it strikes me that, and I'm a great believer in the private sector. I spent time traveling behind the Iron Curtain, and I saw what happened when there is no free market, when the public sector takes over everything, and that's wrong. I like the way the private sector produces goods and services. But I think there are parts of our society and any decent society that are the public sector. I do not want to see public education privatized. The nature of the public sector is to provide equity, to try to level the playing field, and to try to narrow the gaps between the haves and the have-nots, to provide the same national parks to everybody, regardless of your income, to provide the same access to beaches, and hopefully to provide the same access to good education. We're not there yet with education, but I think that the more we move to the private sector, the more we will see increased racial segregation, increased economic segregation, and increased inequity.
Dr. Ravitch, thank you.
Thank you. It's been a great pleasure talking to you.
My pleasure. When we return after a short break, you will hear from one education reformer who is fighting an uphill battle and coming out ahead.
I came in at a moment in time when something was possible that might not have been possible for other people.
finally tonight, we hear from a reformer who is trying and having some successes at repairing one of the most challenged school systems in the country, Baltimore. Dr. Andres Alonso immigrated to the United States from Cuba at age 12. A graduate of public schools, he went on to attend Columbia University and earned 2 advanced degrees from Harvard. Dr. Alonso found his calling as an educator when he took a job as a teacher of emotionally disturbed children in Newark, New Jersey. He went on to become the Deputy Chancellor of New York City Schools and is now the CEO of the Baltimore City Public Schools. When he arrived in Baltimore in 2007, Alonso was under no illusions about how hard his job would be. Much like Detroit, Baltimore suffered from low graduation rates, high poverty, racial segregation, and low student achievement. But the biggest difference between the two cities is that Baltimore has Alonso. We spoke to Dr. Andres Alonso at the City Neighbors Charter School in Northeast Baltimore last week. Doctor, first of all, thank you for doing this. When you came here in 2007, what did you find? How bad was it, or how good was it?
Well, I found a district that had extraordinary challenges, and the challenges are still there. I have 6,000 kids in foster care, 2,000 kids that are homeless, kids in and out of incarceration, huge underachievement, especially in the middle grades and high school grades. Only 23% of my 8th graders in 2007 were proficient in state exams. So kids were going into high school, 77% of them were by definition not in grade level, and they were expected to pass exit tests from high schools that were being introduced the next year in order to pass. A dropout rate that was endemic and huge. We had had almost 4 decades of losing enrollment. 2.5% of the kids disappear every year. So what we did was to basically go to the drawing table and essentially generated a set of initiatives that became about expanding choice, about closing places that were not working, but then offering places that could work. We went hard at the notion of responsibility. So 70% of my principals are new since I arrived, because we were hard on the notion of outcomes. We chose to work with teachers in a very close way. I mean, we avoided some of the controversies of other places because the union gave me a threat and a vote of no confidence when I walked in, but eventually we sort of focused on the work in quite remarkable ways. At some level, everything was about harnessing all that energy that is going into very negative places all the time in school systems, and creating a conversation where there was room for what do we need to do for children. I think we're still there after 4 years, which is quite remarkable to me. I mean, I wake up every day thinking, okay, so when is this dream over, right? But it's been quite a remarkable place, and I always say that it's been about Baltimore. It hasn't been about me. That I came in at a moment in time when something was possible that might not have been possible for other people.
Tell me where we are, what's being done here. Give me the story.
Well, we are in a former failing middle school that we closed, I think 2 years ago, in a community that had turned against the school, wanted the school closed. We were going through a process where we were bringing accountability to the system. We closed 26 schools during that period. And I have always felt that if you're taking away something from a community, and schools are very important to communities, then you have to offer something in return. We approve charter schools in Baltimore City. It's a very close relationship, unlike in many other places where you see a kind of dichotomy between public schools in public charter schools. So this school to me is a remarkable project. And we've been very much about innovation in terms of schools. We will have 34 charter schools in the system next year.
But it's been demonstrated that charter schools, on balance, don't deliver any better than public schools. So, question, why do you have charter schools?
Because some of my charter schools are great, and my job is to encourage great schools.
Such as the one we're in.
Yeah, so it's not about charter schools, it's about expanding the possibilities for kids. I don't differentiate between charter schools and so-called traditional schools. As a matter of fact, I hate the word traditional because it suggests that they shouldn't be about innovation. And part of what we've done is, if charters have autonomy, the other schools should have autonomy as well. That's what we've done. Charters derive huge strength by the commitment of parents. Therefore, the other schools should work around the commitment of parents. What gets in the way? So to me, it's not about charters versus the other schools. All my schools need to be great. It's about figuring out who could be my partners to make things great. I think choice matters, because certainly the middle class has choice, as in all parents have choice, and then school systems are left quite often with parents who cannot afford choice. So my job has been about figuring out a way to give everybody a good choice.
But the point is, before the charter school started, people at the lower end of the economic school had no choice.
Correct.
You either go to the school down the block, whatever it is, or that's it. So charter schools represent choice, not just for the poor, but they include the poor in, you have a choice of schools.
And they represent a form of accountability, which I think is getting missed in the discussion, because the terms of engagement now change. And what has happened here is that there's a dynamic of competition, because so much is about retaining the kids. I give money to schools on the basis of the numbers of kids. That's something that I have done. The money follows the child. So for you to be able to survive as an institution, you have to become as good as the charter school down the street.
What about the argument, I've heard it, you've heard it, that says, you talk, doctor, about competition. The charter school gets in competition with elementary school. But for what reason or another, the elementary school, the public school, if you will, is left with the, quote, dregs, and the charter school gets the cream.
Can I just say that I hate the idea that kids are dregs? I hate that so much. I also hear the notion of you're dumping kids on us as though kids are garbage. I hate it. It's so passive. It's so defeatist. Why should a parent go someplace else unless you're not giving that parent and that child what they need? My point is the following. It's my job to make all schools great. I am not a superintendent who treats charters as my favorite child. Some people think so. I don't. All schools are held accountable. I have closed a charter, for example. We have some amazing schools that are not charters. When you have kids leaving a school, it's because something is not going on there that should be going on there. Because most parents, if given the choice, stay within their neighborhood school.
No Child Left Behind. Did it work or not?
I think it's been incredibly mixed. And I hope it doesn't go away, because there's a huge push against accountability in this conversation.
Well, the most common criticism I hear is that it took us as a nation, as a society by and large, to teaching to the test.
Absolutely.
It did do that.
Absolutely. And part of the problem is that the tests are not good enough. Because I would say that if the tests are good enough, then teaching to the test is not a bad idea. Part of the problem is that we have lousy tests. We have never agreed as a country, as communities, what is it that kids should really know and be able to do? In a way, No Child Left Behind has been very agnostic about what happens in classrooms. It's all been about how schools internalize, interpret the corners that people are cutting in order to get to certain results. Why do schools take like 3 weeks before testing and do test prep. I mean, it's ridiculous. If the child can read, it doesn't matter how much you're going to prep them. The experiment has been flawed in its design, but the execution has been incredibly faulty as well.
Well, now we've morphed into race to the top. Too early to say whether it has failed or shows some sign of succeeding. What do you think?
I mean, it's like a brilliant idea. I mean, I often ask myself, if I had been Secretary of Education, would I have done what Arnie did? And the answer is no, much smarter than I am about these things. Because basically he took this American idea of competition and, you know, borrowed from the Gates book. I mean, for the past 10 years, people have been sort of lining up to get $10 million from Gates, right? Changing high schools, changing this, changing that. Well, now it's a lot more money. The federal government is the patron. And everybody scrambles to change what the laws are. So I thought it was brilliant, and how it translates in the long run, we will see.
Give me some things that you have found worked in Baltimore that you think would work universally, that are worth trying, that's thinking out of the box.
Well, some of these things are not out of the box. They're not necessarily done. First of all, you really do need to respect the community that you serve. Secondly, and what I'm going to say is not about spin. I don't think school systems pay a lot of attention to communication. And if we're not telling a story about what we're trying to accomplish and how we're trying to accomplish it, then how do we expect people to embrace a mission that is highly contentious in some places? The third piece is this notion of really understanding, the importance of what choice means for parents matters tremendously. Those things are huge. Finally, and to me this is very important, the notion of the importance of the child has to be at the center of everything you do. If there isn't a belief in the school system, in a community, that every time you lose a kid, there's a tragedy in the making, then it doesn't matter what you do in terms of school reform, you will not be successful. When I walked in, we had 2,700 kids had dropped out of our high schools in 2007. Last year, 1,100 kids dropped out of school. So huge reduction. Nobody would have seen it as possible beforehand. We celebrated it like crazy because we want to give hope to the city. Still, 1,100 kids dropped out of school, which is completely unacceptable.
Even though it's down from 2,700.
It's been cut by more than half. It doesn't matter. It is completely unacceptable. If an entire organization doesn't feel that, then it doesn't matter what else happened. And the work of the superintendent is to somehow figure out levers that allow certain fundamental things to change and create a stream that carries over time, which is about what's good for kids.
Doctor, thank you very much. You know I'd talk to you the rest of the day. Baltimore's Dr. Andres Alonso. And finally tonight, your thoughts. We received quite a response from our Detroit documentary. This viewer from Detroit emailed us with this: "What a powerful dose of reality we here in Detroit refuse to face. I am so embarrassed and responsible on some level for this disgrace." And then there was this: "I do believe there should have been more positive spotlight put on DPS students. Not all students are living in poverty while their parents are working little to low-end jobs. It is not all bad. There are still many caring teachers, counselors, and principals." And finally, this viewer wrote, "The title National Disgrace is fitting because it is not exclusive to Detroit. It's a problem many inner cities face. I hope all cities that have this problem are able to put the greed aside and work for the best interests of the students." our future. And that's our program for tonight. From New York for HDNet, Dan Rather reporting. Good night. If you would like to add your name to an email list for information on upcoming programs, or if you would just like to send a question or comment, please email us at viewer@hd.net. New York University. He's nationally known for his study into the ways in which schools are influenced by social and economic conditions in urban areas. One of his main focuses is closing the achievement gap between poor and middle economic class children. We spoke with him at the Dual Language Middle School in New York City. Well, first of all, thank you very much for doing this. We've stated on our program, and others have stated almost without exception, that the schools in our country are in crisis. Are we overstating it?
Well, my view is that the crisis we face is a sort of two-pronged crisis. But we've got a lot of success to build on too. And how I would define the crisis is first, is we have pockets of severe underperformance in this country. Pockets especially of kids in poverty, kids of color, kids who've been underserved, and we are not doing right by those kids or our country, because our country won't.
In our documentary, titled A National Disgrace, we showed how years of economic decline, apathy from adults, political infighting, some stealing, and outright neglect have decimated the Detroit public schools.
It was this district that robbed these kids of their education,
Denying more than a generation of children their dreams. The city suffers from a functional illiteracy rate of 47%. That means almost half the population of Detroit cannot read beyond a very basic level. Detroit has some of the lowest standardized test scores ever recorded, and there is a soaring budget deficit.
So, are you in?
Despite valiant efforts by many of the hardest working educators, Detroit seems to be unable to correct the downward spiral. Sadly, Detroit is not an isolated case.
The following is an HDNet original presentation.
Good evening. Tonight we bring you a very special presentation, a conversation with some of the best minds in our country about the state of public schools. This is a topic we find monumentally important not only for our children right now, but also for the future of our nation. We began covering education in Detroit more than 2 years ago. The city is an example of what happens to schools, students, and the city as a whole when the worst circumstances collide. Newark, Buffalo, Cleveland, and many other school systems are struggling, failing to do the very thing they are mandated to do, educate our children. All the more sobering is that this is a problem that no one has managed to successfully address on a large scale. In an effort to improve our schools in 2002, then President George W. Bush signed into law what was called the No Child Left Behind Act. That law mandates that every student in every school be, quote, proficient by 2014. But as that deadline now nears, the reality of our children's educational attainment is stark. More than 80% of our schools will likely be labeled failing. That's right, 4 out of 5 schools are not teaching our children. The Obama administration has issued its own blueprint to tackle the educational crisis, called Race to the Top.
This is one of the largest investments in education reform in American history. And rather than divvying it up and handing it out, we are letting states and school districts compete for it. That's how we can incentivize excellence and spur reform and launch a race to the top in America's public schools.
Race to the Top is a contest among states that awards tens of millions of dollars to those with the best plans to toughen academic standards, recruit and keep effective teachers, track student performance, and turn around failing schools. So we begin our conversation with one of the architects of Race to the Top, John Schnur. Mr. Schnur is also the co-founder and chairman of the board of New Leaders for New Schools. That's a not-for-profit organization that trains principals to lead inter-city schools. We're also joined by Dr. Pedro Noguera, an urban sociologist and professor of education at New